debate. The motion says this House will establish universal jurisdiction for biodiversity. I now welcome the Prime Minister to start the debate here.
When state lines every other state, we erase it. That's where we get the best utility for everyone in the world. What does biodiversity mean in today's debate? Biodiversity refers to the unique species in 3, 2, 1. When state lines harm every other state, we have the right to erase it, and that's what open government is going to do. This we preach is the best utility for every other one. What does biodiversity refer to in today's debate? Biodiversity refers to the unique species of plants, animal, and water, whether micro and macro, that exists within ecosystem that helps to make up ecosystem healthier for everyone in particular places within the exist. It is important to note that in discussing biodiversity, every single harm that happens to a particular species, a particular plant, or a particular animal within whatever space that they exist, do not just have its harms existing within that same borders, but it transcends borders to affect other species and other individuals within specific places, giving to items like one, interconnectivity of these particular species, giving to items like two, and how many of these organisms migrate from one place to another. But tell me that the impact of things like the climate change and the weather are one type. Investor do not exist within like these particular spaces. But because of that, there are three main harms in status quo. One are the issues of climate change, two, the sustainability of the earth, and generally things like the overall temperature of the earth. But why is biodiversity different? Because we can concede that in the vast majority of instances, countries may take particular actions that affect other countries. But why is biodiversity important, and why has it be the one that we prioritize in better jurisdictions? For two main reasons. One, because of the irreversibility of the harms. But for three main reasons. First of all, the harms are irreversible. So as opposed to other issues like economic issues that can be faced with economic issues, whenever there is a harm to a specific species, that when we lose them, we are not able to get them again. But secondly, the harms that happen around that are not able to control. But secondly, the second reason is that for the world as it is now, do not have enough mechanisms for us to be able to protect ourselves from these particular harms. And so it means that it's very important we must act and we must act. But the third reason, which is equally important, that these harms last longer and it transcends like generations and have occurred for generations. And that's how the world as it is now is suffering because of the harm that other generations like did. Three reasons why status quo failed. This is open government engaging the counterfactual and comparative. And three reasons. First of all, the unwillingness of particular states within which these things happen, be able to protect. This happens because of two reasons. One, there's political gains, insofar as selfish political leaders stand to benefit from the mining and the killing of illegal logging or particular species that exist within their niche. But secondly, because this is in the vast majority of instances inform and country policies like industrialization and has like mass benefits to everyone. So even if it's not like selfish, the politicians is like benefiting these particular nations, are still going to engage why these things should not be the reason why every other person like should set out. But the second thing is like on power asymmetry. In the vast majority of instances, where Indian countries would want or have their will be able to persecute and stop some of these instances, they're not able to still and infect this because of two reasons. One, lobbying, one of how like corporate structures exist within this space to prevent these things, and they are able to lobby. But secondly, because in the vast majority of instances, like the instances of biodiversity crimes in Africa, these are perpetrated by MNCs that have so much power to extent that they transcend like the ability of the state to be able to regulate these things like Rebuttal. And then the third reason is that there's lack of jurisdiction. And so even when particular countries want to intervene because the other country cannot do these things, because they do not have legal jurisdiction to be able to persecute that particular MNC, in as much as they have the capacity, they are not able to do these things. What we do on our side is to present you a roadmap model that fits all of these accuracies before I can take a POI for all.
That has this universal jurisdiction looks like, and what kind of jurisdiction would it have?
closing. So our model, which engages CSPI, it's a four-part model. The first thing, but before that, it's important to note that obviously an international body. We argue that this is going to be an independent model that countries would buy in. So we operate, and the first thing is that we are going to operate with the governments that have the capacity to prosecute. Now, in the vast majority of the debate, capacities are going to be monetary, right? Capacity could mean three things. One, legal personnel. Every country can contribute because they have lawyers in their country. Secondly, research. Every country can contribute to these things because they have a significant amount of researchers that can participate in these things. Thirdly, it happens like cooperation. And so even if you cannot be able to contribute these things, your cooperation so far you are able to attend like our programs, so far you are able to have a skill or two. Equally adds up and gives us particular benefits on our side. But also, we think that we are going to like respect like complementarity insofar if you're a company that you are able to prosecute these things, they are going to prosecute these things, they are going to give you the support if you need these things. But you have the opportunity to appeal even if these things don't go in your end, and other countries who can do it like effectively can. But the other two things is that they are going to provide general support for states to be able to create a global system where the sharing of resources into opportunities that may exist to items like industrialization, to items like capacity building. All of these things mean that there's a global approach into ensuring that there's a shared technology and there's a shared way for every economy to be able to engage within the economies, as opposed to a status quo where even those items the countries are able to engage in alternatives are limited and particularly restricted to most likely the West that are advancing in new tech and Africa is suffering. We saw like all of those things. Then there's a chart on like right. So we think that the developing countries in the vast majority of cases are going to cooperate with this because of two reasons, right? First of all, they are affected more by these terms. Insofar they have limited capacity to necessarily engage within these things, but then they cannot escape their hands, right? Means that one, they tend to be affected more and they are not able to engage with us insofar we are able to protect them from MNCs that strong arm them and prevent them from doing what they have to do. But secondly, we argue that they are going to benefit more because they get research, they get the ability to be able to position them to be able to engage in the future, which is the green technology, and they also get information that they can use to access other benefits like bilateral with other countries and other deals that are beneficial to them. But why does we do this most importantly? We know this particular hand because of the advancement technology and how we're able to do these things. So particular countries in the past, where particular MSCs were able to get away with these things because one, there was no international cooperation like helping them to be able to do this thing, but two, there was lack of sufficient research to be able to determine the extent to which a pollution from a mine in Africa is going to affect a pollution and is going to affect the weather in other countries. To the extent where we know these things, it is important to know we must be able to do this now. This means that any argument of these guys like that's the world, they don't have industrialized and then they don't impose this law. It's called because of two reasons. One, I already proved to you why developing countries need this more. But secondly, now we have seen the problem. Now we have more research to be able to engage in doing these things. They should be able to engage why we should not stop, we should stop and we should not do anything about this particular case. What happens when we do not do this thing? Even that we have complete knowledge that our earth is dying because of state line. That we commit self-suicide and it's important for us to value and self-defend the earth and prevent it from state lines corrupting like the earth and killing everyone in the future. Proudly opening that way.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. Let's welcome the leader of opposition to start the debate for open.
Yeah.
Global dominating powers have a proven history of exploitation and the ability to use universal and global institutions to assert governance and to further the exploitation of lesser countries in favor of their own interests and their own development, right? Giving universal jurisdiction for biodiversity to global institutions, which would typically be controlled by leading economies and leading political actors in the global political landscape, robs smaller economies, smaller countries from their sovereignty and their right to self-determine, especially as it relates to the economic nature of biodiversity as an asset, right? What you will get from opening opposition is the understanding of the actual value of biodiversity beyond just this, just this aesthetic value that I think opening government would try to frame it in. We'd then be able to show you how important it is for local for countries to be able to govern and to determine how their own biodiversity as an economic asset is then controlled, right? So first, let me engage opening opposition. When they tell us this universal jurisdiction of biodiversity addresses the issue of the irreversibility of harms from extinction, right? We don't see how giving universal jurisdiction to an international institution, like whatever UN institution they are proposing, then directly addresses the irreversible nature of extinction. We don't find a proper problem solution match in this regard, right? We take in this regard. We tell you that even in the instance that biodiversity is governed by a universal institution or a global institution, when biodiversity dies, when a specific species dies, it still remains extinct. You still can't reverse the loss of species, right? We also tell you you still can reverse the loss of species. Now, in opening matter, we tell you first that this is essentially infringing on the sovereignty of sovereign states, right? We tell you that governments have the right to independently manage and decide on use restrictions of the resources in their own countries, right? We tell you universal jurisdiction removes the right and the duty of biodiversity conservation from governments and from local indigenous communities and places them on external universal institutions that don't have a connection to the biodiversity on the ground in the first place. And then they get to decide on crucial issues such as how people in these countries are able to use their own natural resources, whether they can actually use these natural resources in the first place, and whether people are able to move within biodiversity landscapes like national parks. We feel like this is a huge insult to the ability to the right of local governments and local indigenous communities to self-determine and self-govern. We tell you that this is particularly harmful considering that a majority of the world's biodiversity exists in historically exploited regions like Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. These are regions that have all painful histories of global powers robbing of them of their resources and how they get to use their resources. We tell you that sovereignty is especially important considering the dynamics of power and influence in international governance institutions, where industrialized nations often have undue influence of universal institutions like the ICC and the UN. Right? We don't particularly get any mechanism of how you avoid this kind of exploitation from such countries, given the undue influence of industrialized countries in universal institutions. We find it particularly unjust even, given that most of this biodiversity doesn't even exist in these countries, and they have gone their way to deplete their own biodiversity. We tell you that control and management of biodiversity should rest with those who've been able through history to protect their own biodiversity, such as countries in Africa. It is not a surprise that Africa still holds a majority. Regions such as Africa and Latin America are still some of the most biodiverse regions in the world. Right? We tell you that we would rather trust these countries to govern their own natural resources than some external universal institution which would be probably controlled by industrialized Western nations. Right? We secondly tell you before my second argument, let me take it.
So in Zimbabwe, volcano copper mines is felling trees and polluting the atmosphere. Given that, even in those spaces, there is still a failure by government to check these guys. What's the political instability that these guys talk about? How do you prevent it?
So we feel like in the instance of the lack of capacity in country to protect this biodiversity, we don't necessarily get on their end how giving power to a universal institution that is far removed than an external universal institution, right, to manage and to deal with on-ground issues in terms of like operational efficiency, right? The second thing we tell you that this like proposition we get from government removes control of the economic asset from those who crucially depend on it. We tell you that wildlife is not just a thing of beauty with singular value in terms of like aesthetic value. We tell you that wildlife or biodiversity is a significant economic asset, right? We tell you that like oil and minerals in other countries, biodiversity is an economic asset for which governments, especially in the global south and their local communities, depend for economic development and day-to-day living. We tell you, for example, that in Botswana, through tourism, biodiversity through tourism is the second largest contributor to GDP, right? We tell you that Botswana has built valuable value chains from wildlife and biodiversity, such as through hunting concessions and carbon trading from forest conservation, which earns this country millions of dollars year on year. We tell you that there already exists significant economic incentive for countries to be able to like value investing in biodiversity protection. And we think that it is not enough to rob countries the right to control and manage their own economic resources simply because of universal benefit. We tell you that, for example, although we can agree that one has significant universal benefit and impact, it is not enough to rob them of their ability to trade and manage their own oil.
Thank you very much, leader of opposition. I'm now ready to welcome Deputy Prime Minister to extend the case for which hearing. We're just begin, you are going to like check back so you can see which tries to like ask for POS, get that out of thing. Thank you.
Okay. I think Elo does a better job than Kujo in showing how our status quo has failed, because he has characterized the helplessness of developing countries in solving those problems. He says two contradictory things. The first is that they are only capable of doing these things because they are overrun completely. He said then that governments know these things and they should do it. If they are incapable, how are they able to do it? Because the thing about cooperation is that you accept that I can't do it, so someone to help me to help myself do it. And so if you say that, well, you cannot sacrifice personal benefits for universal benefits, then it doesn't make sense, because the universal benefits helps you if you are in the universe. And so, for example, if we collect an economic exchange in Kenya so that Kenya will be able to export more food to Tanzania, you can't do that because Tanzania also benefits, then it is wrong, especially as these countries are interconnected and Kenya also this debate and make it more reasonable. Well, this is not a configuration. What it means is you cannot compare the debate and win the debate. That's a negative form of response. We see that this and its origin here. We see that the model, you'll be able to prosecute states and companies. For example, we see that the political play is going to be very effective because, for example, if you are chasing a Chinese money in Ghana, someone will go and chase a US money in South Africa because they want to get back as them. We see that these are literally nature of international policies, help these developing countries because these developing countries in status quo are very important to come and help them cause climate change. We see that to the extent where there is an active call for help from developing countries, there is no reason why these guys can win if they don't show that they can solve the problems themselves. Let me do a bit of refreshing. Concessions we have to make if this debate has to be fair. One, biodiversity has its benefits and its harms, affecting more than just any country of origin. Two, internationally, there's a conception that biodiversity needs to be protected. What it means is this is beyond personal benefits, especially as on their side, they provide things like pollution and etc. are necessary for the company to grow. Two responses. One, we see that pollution comes back to help the very locals who die in the heat. Kenyan farmers do not get water because of these specific things. And so you have to weigh getting oil being mined by foreigners versus having Kenyan farmers being able to monetize their farming and feed Kenya and feed the rest of Africa, especially in the context of global warming and other things. Next thing, we see that internationally, there's an idea that harming the environment is wrong. The problem is capacity. This debate is a capacity increasing debate. Should you increase the capacity of countries or should you leave them that way? Because we see that any harm towards biodiversity is a harm committed in great pride and impunity and is the same as homicide. Because what you do is that you say you have the power to prevent people from living off their lives. We think that this is worse than homicide, especially that when it is done with the core intention of hurting people who need these things to survive. Now he says a lot of things about tourism, and that is why we win the debate. Wow. Because you see that biodiversity affects three key areas. One, hospitality. That's why tomorrow they said we should come for the excursion because there is a park. There are giraffes. These are things that are only existent and that Kenya is able to monetize because those things exist. On their side, they say, oh, it's a really monster. Let Kenya do what they like to the giraffe. If it's even killing them, it's their giraffe and they do what they want with it. We think that this doesn't only affect the tourism industry, it affects hospitality, the hotels that those tourists sleep in, and the people who feed those tourists. We think that this is an expanded impact that moves beyond animal rights, even though it's an important conversation in today's debate. Two, what we say is that our impact is very important because we need more people to come and unsustainable methods of living, especially as the sustainable methods are taken away from them. The debate is boring, any keyword. Paul realized CEO has chosen not to engage, and so this model is de facto the winning model in this quarterfinal. Next thing, what we say is from their side, there's a forceful transfer of resources like Bengal targets being taken away from India just because US says they can protect them better. What the debate exists is simple, and this is what should guide you in your deliberation. One, payback politics is something that is real and something that we want, such that countries should be able to check their excesses, do things like paying huge fines and stuff like that. Realize this is not an opt-out configuration where you can say, oh, pay, and you say you will not pay and stuff like that. This is a binding international union, and you need to show how this will not happen. And if you do that, you are not engaging a policy debate. Secondly, the debate exists in the now. What it means is that if you are able to prove that there will be future benefit, because it says we cannot see the animals that are extinct, but we say we can stop further animals from getting extinct. On their side, it is a case of constant government and developing countries begging the West to help them. In today's debate, Paul, we say that on OG, everybody benefits from biodiversity. Thus, everybody should be responsible for it. Proud OG.
Thank you very much, Deputy Prime Minister. Let's conclude the opening half of the debate by welcoming the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Thank you.
our stance is not to defend the status quo, but rather to further economic incentive needs to be created for countries to invest in wildlife economy. In our world, leveraging the economic value of biodiversity for the people who live in that biodiversity is more likely and realistic for countries to invest in biodiversity protection, because we believe in the world that we are creating, the first person we consider is the person who exists in this biodiversity. They come and make a case for the excursion we are going to see tomorrow, and you can clearly see where their value is in the aesthetic part of biodiversity, not on the practical economic impact that it has. One, for the people who exist in that biodiversity, who are the primary stakeholders, and they do not tell us why. It's an incentive for us to focus, it's an incentive for us to value more the global benefits and impacts before we consider the impact to the primary person who exists in that biodiversity. Listen, in this debate, it is very important to understand again that biodiversity exists in a context of people living in it and coexisting with it. It's not an idea that is just abstract and there, which we can debate without considering the people who exist in it. And that's why on side government, we argue first and foremost for the sovereignty of the people. The primary stakeholder in this part is the person who actually exists in that biodiversity. And that's why we find that their case is weak, because it does not in any way show how the primary person benefits or how actually the harms will exist more. Will exist more in our world for that primary person. Because we also believe one thing that we must consider in this debate is the fact that the harms and benefits of biodiversity protection, they first accrue to the primary stakeholder. So he's already incentivized to do good, because whatever evil that happens to biodiversity, it will affect him before it affects the global world that wants to govern this so-called biodiversity. Okay, we oppose this whole motion on two merits. One, on the universal nature of jurisdictions. We've seen universal jurisdictions being applied in global trade and other areas in politics and diplomacy. And we've seen that it has already failed. It has already failed to realize benefits for the individuals who entered into that universal jurisdiction agreement. And we are not for extending this form of jurisdiction on something as important as biodiversity, which, especially let's say for a place in Africa, we are so endowed with it compared to the people who have more power to control that biodiversity in a universal jurisdiction excel. We also argue this motion and oppose it on the impact that biodiversity is important for the economic development of each and every country. And therefore we believe placing that right or that power in the hands of an external force is highly harmful or is highly tricky to exist because it gives leverage for bigger economies or bigger players in this universal jurisdiction order to take advantage of a country's source of economic value on something as important as jurisdiction. What we get from opening government? Opening government argue on a very important thing when they say utility for everyone is achieved on their side. But we ask, whose utility is first important? Global utility or the utility of the person who lives in that biodiversity? Because what they give the example that they use animals to give the example that the interconnectivity of species, that it will allow for people to protect endangered species and all that. But we say, for example, when you think about biodiversity, there's animals that exist in certain countries and they don't exist in another. In a universal jurisdiction over biodiversity, when we are making decisions that affect those species, the way we value those species in our community is not the same way America or Australia will value those animals. So the decisions that will be made on that biodiversity will be very problematic because we do not value those keys to biodiversity the same way. And then they also make an issue about politicians taking advantage taking advantage, for example, of exacerbating mining activity that harm the environment. But this also exists in a world of universal jurisdiction, because like we say, whatever argument you can ever come up with in this one, there will always be somebody who has a higher leverage than the other when they're making a decision. So still personal interest from big economies can't come and play into how you manage your own biodiversity. I'll take it before I continue.
You can't create your own model and engage. You need to engage our model when countries cooperate to make these things work. We increase capacity, if the opening half agrees that protecting biodiversity is good, and we are looking how these things trickle down to the average
Thank
person
you.
in every
Thank you. I'll stop you there. In creating benefits for the people who exist, I've said already we are motivated primarily by the virtue that biodiversity harms and benefits the individual first before anybody else. So incentive to actually do good exists on our side, and the impacts that will be good exist on our side because already these people will face the dangers of the benefits first. So why should we let somebody else who will not live in that reality? It will take 10 years before what we do in Kakamega Forest here in Kenya will impact somebody in California, USA. But if USA makes a decision on that forest in Kenya, it will impact that person immediately before it even impacts me. And that's the way that we are making. And they say that it will allow for people to share technologies and resources to manage this. And I'll show you, in a universal jurisdiction model, that has already failed largely because we've seen even in trade, people, certain economies are not willing to share their technologies and means to achieving their own, common prosperity. So we do not believe that in a universal jurisdiction for biodiversity, this will exist because already people don't want to share vaccines with us, they don't want to share medical patents with us, and then you believe now if you do global universal on biodiversity, they're willing to share the means that help us protect our environment. We highly doubt that's possible from their side. And that's why we believe that aside opening opposition, we show you in this debate that biodiversity, first and foremost, is not an abstract thing. It's a real existence in the lives of people and everyday life. And therefore, the benefits and harms, before they become a global concern, it should be argued on the primary stakeholder. How does it benefit them for somebody else to determine something as important to them as biodiversity? And we show that the model they are proposing, historically in other areas, it has already failed and it cannot be scaled now to biodiversity. Where we tell you now instead we should focus on us predetermining our own biodiversity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Leader of ARPA. And now we have come to the end of the opening half of today's debate. So now let's welcome the member of government to start the debate on the closing half. Here.
Since this one is being recorded, I'd like everyone to know that I shouldn't be tied to whatever I say here, in case you want to employ me. I'm very, very good. But big shout outs to the number of accountant. Alright, so we're starting in 3, 2, 1. Mr. Chair, we need to recognize that the earth in its present state is unsustainable. This is an uncontestable fact because of 3 important reasons. 1, projections show how the earth will implode, whether now or in the long term. That is why a lot of space exploration is being done by big countries. Recognize that these are things that are not open to everyone because Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya are not engaging in space exploration because they don't have the finances to do so. This is why the only option to that is like individuals like Elon Musk who do SpaceX projects. 2, we are facing direct harms and problems in status quo because of the effect or the direct harms that is being caused by biodiversity. This looks like bushfires in California, the Amazons. This secondly looks like the erratic rainfall that goes on in Western and Eastern Africa. That is why the rain patterns in Kenya are different, rain patterns in Ghana are equally different in status quo. But thirdly, we think that this equally, it looks like the flora and fauna all over the world are increasingly taking a nosedive in their numbers, which affects everyone due to the difference in feeding patterns, like the commensalism and the different feeding patterns that exist. Why is this particularly relevant? This means that we cannot in any way say that today's debate exists on an obscurity of harms. The harms are manifold.
we know it's going to happen. The conversation then becomes, how do we solve them? But two, it equally means we cannot say that the harms are not happening now. In status quo, the harms are going on. So what that means then is that an action needs to be taken. You cannot claim that everything is fine and we are going to solve it. You can't equally claim that we will do better without charting how you are going to do better. This is a debate that operates on mechanics. It's a this house will debate. Policy motion. Show us how you do it. OO fails to show you how they do anything in their world. All they do is tell you how there are certain gains from allowing status quo to remain. We think that those gains can equally exist in our model, and that is the main purpose of our case. So I'm going to show you how that works. But we think that secondly, the abuse of biodiversity happens in two fronts. It could happen locally within states. It could happen on non-state borders. The debate you've had thus far has been one that engages on state abuse, etc., etc. We'll even show you how we do better on that. But even on non-state borders, like drilling for oil in the South China Sea, are things that happen largely because there is no law that particularly governs over that area. We think that the inability to be able to create protective patterns or protective frameworks to be able to govern those spaces makes it largely impossible and improbable for anybody or any state to be able to take action. But why is it particularly bad? It is bad because the effects of this action disproportionately affect individual states in status quo. So because someone is messing up in the South China Sea, there is lower amounts of rainfall in Kenya. Because someone is messing up in Zimbabwe, you have higher levels of heat in the Amazon in Brazil. What this means then is that we need to be able to establish the fact that there is a direct correlation between the inaction that takes place and the effect and suffering that happens in status quo. But let's even engage the debate on country levels. Why do we win on country levels? We think that the reason why a lot of countries that constantly face a lot of biodiversity abuse cannot get any level of absolution is because of three primary reasons. Before I even give you my three reasons, recognize that the only reason you get from OG is political lobbying being done by MNCs. We'll take the step further and give you three more. One, the insufficiency of resources financially. MNCs are largely richer. So whenever these states say that we are going to slap you with a fine, they pay the fine and they move on. This is a story of cobalt in Congo and Apple and how they constantly exploit these spaces. Two, the lack of political will to take action. Because recognize, and this is very, very important, recognize everybody engages the best case scenario. In the worst case scenario, we need to recognize that certain times these abuses are done by state-owned corporations. This looks like Saudi Aramco abusing the environment in Saudi Arabia, and because it's a state-owned corporation, the state cannot hold it to account. But the effect of that abuse to land, to trees, largely affect everybody disproportionately. We think that the inability to take that action means that you never have any level of accountability in those spaces. Thirdly, this looks like political dependency. In my country, Ghana, our bauxite has been fully ceded to the Chinese government. What this means is that even if we want to do anything, we cannot, because we have large levels of dependency on Chinese debt and the amount of money that they cede to our nations. All these things mean that you cannot be able to fiat from opposition how exactly these minority states are going to be able to survive in that regard. The question then becomes, how does universal jurisdiction solve the larger majority of this problem? Recognize that there are two ways universal jurisdiction could work. Again, a step ahead of the opening half. They claim that the way it's going to operate is largely because they are going to create a universal body. That's a fair engagement. However, I recognize that universal jurisdiction could equally operate on like the grounds of not having any taking MNCs or taking other states to court because of actions they've taken. Clear example, Belgium took a lot of individuals who participated in a genocide in Rwanda to court, and particularly was able to hold them to account for that. That's how universal jurisdiction works. It does not compulsorily have to be, let's create something like the ICC. What this means is that we successfully mitigated all the harms from OO, which claims that there is going to be Western imperialism in these spaces. But before I continue, opening. Yeah, I'm going to explain state buying. We think that state buying largely happens on several levels. We think, one, the harms are apparent. I've shown you how these things are urgent, these things need to happen. But secondly, we think that the biggest pushback you could have to that is, again, Western overthrow. How do we know that that's not going to happen? We think that three structural reasons exist. One, there are internal pressure groups that constantly are pushing states like the US, like the UK, to act in situations of this nature so that they do not fall victims to it because of things like I said, higher levels of heat in California and bushfires in those places. Two, we think that there's an increasing popularity and progress in environmentally conscious products like electric cars, and it's gradually growing cheaper as time progresses. This means that individuals can now access the things that do not largely pollute environment, so you don't need to drill into like state soil and whatnot. But thirdly, we think worst case scenario, the vested interest that exists makes it possible for you to counteract it. If the US wants to be oppressive, China, in their bid to become a superpower, is going to counter.
Member of government. Yeah, let's welcome the member of opposition to also start the case for closing up. Here.
One. Panel, notice that the basic concession that every house, all the sides agree with is that at the end of the day, there are harms with status quo, there are harms in status quo within how countries evolve with when it comes to things like climate and other things. This is a policy motion. You are not supposed to the harm is independent and all other things. They are supposed to show us, given that there is a threat within status quo and there is so much huge pressure on issues how to solve climate change, that universal jurisdiction is one that is going to solve the problem. They are unable to show from their side how this necessarily is going to solve the problem. From CO, what we will necessarily do is that at the end of the day, we will tell you how this particular policy in itself is one that are not probably going to be implemented. We'll show you how it is going to get less buy-in, and I will tell you how at the end of the day, this is something that is going to be inconsistent with the laws and the criminal jurisdiction that exists within state. But before that, let's get some setup. We think that necessarily what harm the activism against biodiversity, especially within poor countries, is this. First of all, we think that there is less bioactivism within these particular countries. Secondly, animal rights get less concern within those instances. But then thirdly, there is huge state protection against things like zoos. National parks are being protected and reserved as places that are most likely important to the cultural practices of these particular countries. We think that there are softer regulations because other people have moved from different first world countries to be able to establish business there. So this in itself already tells you that when it's going to be a general law that is going to govern these particular things, that in itself is going to be inconsistent first to the kind of rules and regulations that exist. They are able to show us how immediately they are going to streamline this in order to be able to make it merge with it. But then secondly, this also tells you that these particular third world countries are more likely not going to be cooperate. I'll tell you how, simply because they are inconsistent with their country. So the biggest impact here is that these particular developing countries are the biggest threat to against biodiversity preservation. And the policy doesn't have control to that extent. They need to prove that before they can win today's debate. But first of all, let's go to my first argument. Panel, we think that at the end of the day, the nature of biodiversity is that it transcends the cultural practices and affects each species and how. This is why cultural practices of people, or people have their way of life and relating within cultural practices. Putting universality undermines the very cultural practices some countries have. Example, 1, Indians worship cows, Ghanaians eat cows. Secondly, Dubai people see things like tigers as pets, but Africans see them as threats. That marginal differences that exist between this particular species and how countries see them means that their policies is less likely going to work, and we think there's going to be less cooperation within all countries. With only this alone, we are already winning from size CO. But then the second thing you need to understand when it comes to things like biodiversity is this. Second extension. The important aspect that exists fundamentally to the things like the justice system is the concept of common law. This is missing in biodiversity. Common law missing in biodiversity. This is why there are factors that exist when it comes to considering common law. 1, common law exists with taking into consideration of the socio-economic aspects of individuals. Secondly, cultural circumstances and the nature and events that contribute to a crime within particular state. This is how sentencing happens, and those factors are what constitute sentencing in all those instances. Before that, I'll take COO. OG.
You can't argue that the policy won't work because that's against the manner. If Indians worship cows and Ghanaians eat cows, if you tell Ghanaians to reduce their consumption of cows, it benefits everyone given the impact it's already moving. You can make this work.
So Pana, just by the virtue of you bringing it, it means that jurisdiction, it means that there's going to be, people are going to be held accountable for going against it. They are unable to show me how immediately that they are going to universalize this particular culture that exists and how they are going to buy in. I don't think their policy is something that is going to work. So on the common law, we think that sentences are based on the factors I've already mentioned, cultural practices and how people see things. That means that the reason why, so panel, notice how this is categorically different. The reason why they can justify, or things like war crimes can be justified, is because they deviate from the normal activities of people. This particular universal biodiversity necessarily does not take into account the normal behaviors and the daily activities of individuals. Examples I already gave you on top. Which means that at the end of the day, there's no justification for you to say that we are going to put a universal law on how you relate with the ecosystem, because other people have different ways they relate to that particular system. They are able to tell us how immediately they are going to solve that. With this, we are winning already from CEO. But then, at the end of the day, because this is not conformity with common law, which means that the very big people they say is going to harm, at the end of the day, are not going to cooperate, because first of all, let's even assume that everyone is being harmed. But again, when this harm comes, the first people who get the harm are the originators of this particular piece, i.e. those who exist within the state. We think in principle, it is justified for them to be able to show how this particular policy will work. At the end of the day, international or universal jurisdiction doesn't give them the opportunity to do that. But then we tell you at the end of the day that the alternative here we have is that we providing universal monetary system. That looks like this. First of all, you coagulate the resources from global and international organizations, because that is the duty of globalization in first place. It gave the African countries power to be able to look for so many things. What you do in universal jurisdiction is that you take that power away from them. They are unable to be able to get that. We think that kind of itself, the only instance we need to help them is decentralize that particular support and effort within this particular state, allowing them to still be able to conform with the society while still holding their culture. We think that is very important. You recognize that in today's debate. But then why is that very difficult to be able to implement again? The process of conviction and establishment of a culpability is relatively low when it comes to things like biodiversity. Why? In criminal cases, you rely mostly on testimonies and other things. People are only, I told you, because of their culture, they are likely going to cooperate with you. We think to the extent where individuals themselves, especially those who exist within these countries, are not going to cooperate with you. There's no way this particular thing is going to work, because you rely on evidences. You won't get it because the people don't cooperate with you. With this, we are more than proud to oppose. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, member of OP. So let's listen to the last speaker from the government bench. Yeah, here.
They are mining oil in a way that protects the environment, or they are doing it unsustainably. So the only time we can take Ghana to court for eating cows is when we are overeating the cows and the cows are going extinct, or we are not doing it sustainably, right? And so that's the only just time where these things will be justified. So CEO's case sounds smart, but when you really think about it, there's really no sense in it. But the second thing that CEO lacks in today's debate is the justification of status quo and how status quo is going to solve these problems. So it's not enough for an op team to point out that, oh, there are certain harms in the model that will bring. You have to be able to defend status quo and how status quo is one that deals with these problems. That's the second thing that CEO faces within today's debate, right? So they say that, oh, well, they want to protect certain cultural practices. So let's assume that even if these things are certain cultural practices, we have justification to counter them insofar as it is threatening the human race or the planet in general. So the fact that your cultural practice is something that you want does not make it holistic or absolute. We can be able to take away that cultural practice or try you for it if it's antithetical to the entire human race, if there's a likelihood that the entire planet will suffer and would all go extinct eventually. And that's why their case is one that's problematic. The second pushback they give to us is that, oh, well, they think that, oh, well, countries not cooperate. Nobody has an incentive to sign on. Prosper already explains that in his speech. He says that, oh, well, there are internal pressure from certain countries. So, for example, people are voting for green policies in the UK and the US, right? So, as a political party, as a government, there's an incentive for you to sign on to these things. Else you look like you don't care about the environment at all, and the voters won't even vote for you in the first place. That's one mechanism. But the second mechanism is that there are things like NGOs and things like that that are pushing for government to do these things. Third mechanism, especially for developing countries, is that for those guys, you are likely to get some benefits. So, for example, the Paris Climate Accord, developing countries get some grants and some money or some petty points through it, right? And so, these are all incentives for people to join these things. So, the biggest case of CEO is that, oh, well, people won't join. I've proved why they will join. They said these policies will not be streamlined. I've shown how they'll be streamlined because if there's a problem, if there's a threat to the entire human race, we can take away that specific cultural practice that you want to protect so much. So the cooperation you want to achieve is one that would ultimately get on our side of the house, right? So what's our extension to this debate, right? So what Prosper explains is the problem that has been lacking in the entire debate so far, right? Because nobody explains how these things are likely to happen or the way in which these things will be able to solve the policies, right? Because the entire problem with the debate so far is they assume that there are already internal checking mechanisms on these countries. Prosper shows how those things do not exist. How? So, for example, in the South China Sea, people are mining over there, people are drilling oil over there, right? But then the effects are ones that cut across the entire planet. And because there's no specific jurisdiction over there, there's no incentive for anyone to be able to solve these problems. Second thing is that, so for example, maybe in your country, what is under threat is animals, and water is in abundance. So there's more incentive for you to care about animals. And so you don't care about water because it's in abundance. But the water that you are polluting is one that's affecting another country. So that means that even if there's an incentive for these countries to care about these things, they only care about the ones that affect them because there's no internal pressure to solve these things because they don't affect you. So they only solve the ones that affect them. That means that these things are the things that Prosper identifies in his speech, and that's why our case is the most robust and the most relevant relevant within today's debate. Let's go to opening opposition and why we take them out of today's debate. So the first thing they try to explain is that, sorry about that. So the first thing they try to explain is that, countries need to be given the chance to determine how they should protect their own biodiversity, right? Note the two things we explain here. Number one, countries specifically, especially political parties, only care about the short-term benefits. So for example, they'll try to mine oil in Nigeria to get all the economic benefits because they want people to vote for them, and did not care about the sustainability of these things or how these things will play in the long run. So at best, even if there's an incentive, that incentive only exists in the short term because they want to reap massive economic benefits and they don't care about the long term. Secondly, sometimes the effect does not affect the people living in these countries but affects other people. I'm going to give another example. So when Saudi Arabia, specifically Dubai, right, was building islands on the seas, note that there was flooding in countries like Thailand and Bangladesh and Indonesia and all those countries, right? That means that these things can affect other countries, right? And so they should be given the mandate to be able to check those things, and that's the principle that's the most important within today's debate. Second thing they say is that, developing countries need to exploit their environment in order to develop. So for example, Nigeria needs to be able to use oil in order to be able to develop their country. Note the two things we say here. Firstly, we are not against using your resources. We are only against using it when it is not sustainable, right? You can mine oil, but don't pollute your water bodies. Ensure that these things are done in a sustainable way such that the environment is not polluted. That means that we can still get the benefits of economic development, but we're doing it sustainably on our side of the house. Second thing they say is that, the West exploited these countries. They took away their resources, right? And so they should be able to use those resources to better ourselves. Note, the fact that the West did these harms does not mean we should also continuously perpetuate these harms, right? And so that can be a justification for doing these harms, and that's why they don't have a case in today's debate. The last thing they say is that, these bodies won't understand the issues on the ground. Like, come on, man. I'm sure these bodies are like... Right? That means that you present evidence, right? So if they don't understand the issues that face your country, if it affects the sustainability of the environment, right? And the reason why we wait specifically from closing government is because we explain how specifically, first of all, countries are likely to sign onto these things because of the benefits that they're likely to get, and secondly, how we are able to solve these problems, right? Because we're able to target specific places that have no jurisdiction at all, primarily closing governments.
Thank you very much, closing government. Now let's listen to the opposition whip to close the entirety of the debate. Here.
Is because for you to have a certain form of universalization, you go through a certain form of diplomatic bureaucracies which delays the action in itself. What it means is that you have to convince countries beyond reasonable doubt within a long period of time for them to be able to agency that they want necessarily is not one that is fast tracked. But then the second thing they say is that, jurisdictions that exist without any power are also protected. We think that cannot be the debate because the kind of harms that exist within those spaces are largely negligible. The ones that happen are the ones that are barefaced, happening in real countries with real governments that nobody is doing. What that means is that you can always set specific actions to target those neglected areas. We do not think a universalized system is something that is better. CG is out of today's debate. Why is OG funny? They assume that poor countries necessarily care about biodiversity and the protection of this. The reason why we think this is untrue is because of one, we think that they, like, aside the idea that they culturalize some of these things that lead to their sustainability. Second, there is a huge economic incentive which they do not show how they are unlikely to trade off because their sustenance, like hunger, feeding, exist on these particular like resources and biodiversity. They do not show us completely how they are going to neglect all of those trade-offs they use out in today's debate. The second thing that's very problematic is because they talk about the NMC. The reason why they have not been able to achieve much is because these countries are unlikely to trade off these economic benefits. But in most instances of like African countries, they believe their culture and its preservation forms part of their sustainability. That is the reason why most African countries still do not think that LGBTQ rights are ones that they should keep, because they think that the sustainability of their state is dependent on procreation, etc. We think religion and cultural diversity is one that promotes the individual's sustainability. You cannot confer a universal sustainability and the metric on people. You lose out on today's debate. They fail to prove very critically what the incentive will be. They do not show why immediately when these people join, they will care. But why is this debate about an alternative? First, we think that there is a problem-solution mismatch. First, these people say we should talk about not cows, but things that are going extinct. The reason why that is funny is because every single contribution, no matter how small it is, leads and contributes to the destruction of the earth. What it means is that your problem cannot just be about extinction. If it's about extinction, what you best want to do is to encourage nations by funding them to build national park to preserve those things for you. But then secondly, we think that an alternative that is better is by providing cheaper energy provisions for these countries to be able to reduce on how much they burn firewood. What you do in my village is to provide LPG, is to provide cheaper electronic cars for us to be able to do. But the third thing is that you provide cheaper importation of food. That means that people are likely going to have the ability to relate in that particular regard and hear your comment. That is the reason why when missionaries came here, they were interested in buying into, like, for the do not show how immediately people will care about that idea and join. We win because we tell you better that you better have most of these things happening within spaces whereby they are able to provide alternatives. Why do we win today's debate? On a couple of clashes, first, feasibility, we argue that radical environmental protection has never worked because of these specificities that exist within the state. But then secondly, they do not show how they are going to like trade off the economic incentive, especially in poor countries whereby their sustainability and a daily life depends on the pig that they kill to eat. The rules out of today's debate. Secondly, they are unable to deal with solvency. Who are two things. First, what happens if they even join? What it means is that any action that continues to happen means that you sanction them. OG says you sanction them. The reason why the sanction is very funny is because they will now just get tired of you and continue to act in a very bad manner because they do not see the reason why, because they do not show what additional benefits that will come with the jurisdiction to cushion these countries. But the second thing, if they don't join, they become a threat to you. The few people that join, you are unable to achieve much because whatever happens anywhere happens everywhere. Before that, OG. That is the problem. That is the problem. But everyone wants to use cows to self-sustain themselves. You do not push a one-sided or a particularly centralized idea on universality, on these particular disparities that exist. Your fault. Deterrence. We think that this is not effective enough because of two things. First, I've already told you that these poor countries kill these animals as a form of self-sustenance. What it means is that they tag them as necessary crimes. What it means is that they do not have an incentive to solve that mechanism or to immediately quit it, and you do not show how you cushion them. You lose out on today's debate on getting that. The second thing on deterrence is that, in fact, they do not care about any punishment to give them because they do not see it as importantly proximate to the kind of benefits that they get from eating these animals. The last thing is on the impact on smaller countries. While they are unable to show the huge economic disparity that is going to exist, they also do not show how poor countries are going to have a power to decide. What it means is that Western ideas on the ability for you to use wildlife in a certain way are most likely going to be pushed on them. So dogs will not be seen as meals, but then pests. What it means is that you constantly push like majority and Western ideologies on poorer countries. You do not give them any ability to be able to contribute. But then the last thing is that there is going to be active targeting of these people as a means of exploitation, because at the end of the day, everybody argues that we will all come together to form these walls. The reason why bigger countries will be able to take advantage of this is because the funding and everything will come from them. What that means is that they are constantly being able to monopolize decision-making processes in their favor. What that looks like is that there is going to be very biased power control within this state. We can cripple the fight when there are instances whereby there are power struggles within interest, within conservative groups, and things they can get. You get that there is a clear form of power bias which collapses the whole agenda and makes it disinfective. Why do we win today's debate? First, we clearly distinguish ourselves from opening when we say this debate cannot be about state sovereignty, because OG says it is a choice. They do not show us why that choice they are going to give up on the food they eat and their cultural values to join. Secondly, we give you two robust extensions on how that affects the criminal justice system within localized jurisdiction. Two, we tell you how cultural dissimilarities are important and leads to the sustainability of these people. Hence, there is no need real for them to opt in. No side brings better alternatives, break us to the semi-final. Proud CEO.
Thank you very much, everyone. We sincerely appreciate all of your speeches, and we would meet right here. Thank you.